Look, before we talk about what happened in Badong Kali on December 12, 1948, you need to understand something. This wasn't just a random act of violence. This was part of a war. A brutal, dirty war that Britain doesn't like to talk about. They called it the Malayan Emergency. Not a war. An emergency. Because if they called it a war, British insurance companies wouldn't have to pay out. Rubber plantation owners wouldn't get compensation. So it was an emergency. But make no mistake. It was a war. After World War II ended in 1945, the world started changing fast. Colonial empires were crumbling. People who'd been colonized for centuries were demanding independence. India got it in 1947. Indonesia was fighting the Dutch for it. Vietnam was fighting the French. And in Malaya, modern-day Malaysia, communist guerrillas were fighting the British. The Malayan Communist Party, mostly ethnic Chinese, had fought alongside the British against the Japanese during World War II. The British had trained them, armed them, called them heroes. But when the war ended, those same guerrillas turned their weapons on their former allies. They wanted independence. They wanted communism. They wanted the British gone. So in 1948, the British declared a state of emergency, sent in troops, and started a counterinsurgency campaign that would last 12 years and cost thousands of lives. The Scots Guards were one of the British regiments sent to Malaya. Elite soldiers. Professional. Disciplined. In December 1948, a patrol from the Scots Guards was sent to a small village called Badong Kali. It was in Selangor, about 20 miles north of Kuala Lumpur. The village was tiny. Maybe 180 people. Mostly rubber tappers, workers who collected latex from rubber trees on nearby plantations. Poor people. Trying to survive in a country torn apart by war. The official reason for the patrol? Intelligence suggested communist guerrillas might be in the area. The soldiers were to search the village. Question the residents. Look for weapons or supplies. What actually happened was very different. On December 12, 1948, British soldiers entered Badong Kali. They rounded up the villagers. Separated the men from the women and children. Put the men in two groups. And then, in the early morning hours of December 12, they executed 24 unarmed men. Shot them in cold blood. Then burned the village. The British Army's official story? The men were trying to escape. The soldiers had no choice but to shoot them. It was a legitimate military action against suspected communist sympathizers. But the villagers who survived told a different story. A story of unarmed men begging for their lives. Of soldiers following orders to kill. Of a massacre. For decades, the British government denied it. Covered it up. Threatened witnesses. Destroyed evidence. But the truth has a way of coming out. And the truth about Badong Kali is one of the darkest chapters in British military history. This is the story of what really happened. The story the British government didn't want you to know. The patrol that went to Badong Kali was led by Captain George Ramsay. He commanded G Company of the 2nd Battalion Scots Guards. 14 soldiers in total. They'd been in Malaya for months. Long enough to see what this war really looked like. Ambushes. Booby traps. An enemy that melted into the jungle and the villages. An enemy that looked just like the civilians you were supposed to be protecting. It was the kind of war that made soldiers paranoid. That made them see threats everywhere. That made them stop seeing the people they encountered as human beings and start seeing them as potential enemies. December 11, 1948. The patrol set out from their base. They were supposed to search several villages in the area for communist guerrillas. Badong Kali was just one stop on their route. They arrived at Batong Kali in the afternoon. The village was small. Just a collection of wooden houses along a dirt road. Rubber trees all around. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone. The soldiers immediately took control. They ordered all the villagers to assemble in the village center. Men, women, children. About 180 people in total. The soldiers searched the houses, looking for weapons, ammunition, communist literature. Anything that might indicate the villagers were helping the guerrillas. They found nothing. No weapons. No communist materials. Nothing. But the soldiers weren't satisfied. According to the survivors, the soldiers separated the men from the women and children. Divided the 24 adult men into two groups. The women and children were ordered into a building and told to stay there. The men were held outside. What happened next depends on who you ask. According to the British Army's official account, the soldiers decided to move the men to a new location for further questioning. As they were being moved, the men tried to escape into the jungle. The soldiers had no choice but to open fire. But the survivors, the women and children who witnessed what happened, told a very different story. They said the men were lined up. That soldiers stood in front of them with rifles. That the men begged for their lives. Said they weren't communists. Said they were just rubber tappers trying to feed their families. And then the soldiers opened fire. Chong Hong was 8 years old. She watched through a window as her father was killed. Years later, she described what she saw. The soldiers made the men stand in a line. My father was there. I could see him. He looked scared. Then the soldiers started shooting. I saw my father fall. I saw blood. So much blood. The shooting lasted minutes. When it was over, 24 men lay dead. Some had been shot multiple times. Some had tried to run and been shot in the back. The soldiers then set fire to the village. Burned the houses. Destroyed everything. They told the surviving women and children to leave. To go to another village. Not to come back. Not to talk about what they'd seen. And then the patrol left. Returned to base. Reported a successful operation against communist guerrillas attempting to escape. The official report said the soldiers had killed 24 bandits who were trying to flee. It was filed as a legitimate combat engagement. No investigation was conducted. No questions were asked. But the women and children of Batong Kali knew the truth. And they would spend the rest of their lives trying to get someone, anyone, to listen. The British Army in Malaya was quick to praise the Batong Kali operation. According to their version, the Scots Guards had eliminated a significant number of communist terrorists. It was a success. But almost immediately, there were questions. Whispers. Doubts. Other British soldiers who'd been in the area heard things. Stories that didn't quite match the official account. Rumors that the men killed at Batong Kali had been unarmed. That they'd been executed, not killed in combat. In January 1949, just weeks after the massacre, a British newspaper, The People, published a story. It was based on an anonymous tip from someone who'd been there. Someone who couldn't live with what they'd seen. The headline was shocking: Massacre of Innocents. The article claimed that British soldiers had murdered unarmed villagers in cold blood. That it wasn't combat. It was execution. The British government's response was swift and aggressive. They denied everything. Said the story was false. Communist propaganda designed to undermine British forces in Malaya. They launched an investigation. But not a real one. Not an honest attempt to find out what happened. It was a whitewash. An exercise in damage control. The investigator talked to the soldiers who'd been at Batong Kali. Every single one told the same story. The men had tried to escape. The shooting was justified. It was combat, not murder. The investigator didn't talk to the survivors. Didn't interview the women and children who'd witnessed the killings. Didn't examine the bodies or the scene. The conclusion was predetermined: no wrongdoing. The soldiers had acted appropriately. Case closed. But the story didn't die. It kept coming up. Other newspapers picked it up. Questions were asked in Parliament. Survivors kept talking, even though no one with power wanted to listen. The British government's strategy was simple: deny, delay, and destroy evidence. Documents about Batong Kali were classified. Witnesses were discouraged from speaking. Some were threatened. The message was clear. Let this go, or there will be consequences. And it worked. For decades, it worked. The soldiers who'd been there went home. Most of them stayed quiet. Some felt guilty but didn't know what to do about it. Others convinced themselves that what they'd done was necessary. That it was war. But a few couldn't live with it. A few, years later, would come forward and tell the truth. And when they did, they'd face consequences. Threats. Harassment. Prosecution for breaking the Official Secrets Act. Because the British government had decided that the truth about Batong Kali was more dangerous than the lie. And they would spend the next 70 years maintaining that lie. While the British government was busy covering up what happened, the survivors of Batong Kali were trying to rebuild their lives. And trying to get someone to hear their truth. Lo Ah Choi was one of the survivors. She'd been a young woman in 1948. She'd watched the soldiers kill her husband. They made him kneel, she said in an interview years later. He was begging them. Telling them he wasn't a communist. He was just a rubber tapper. He had children. He had a wife. Please don't kill him. They shot him anyway. Right in front of me. And then they laughed. The soldiers laughed. Lo Ah Choi spent the rest of her life fighting for recognition of what happened. For justice. For an apology. She died in 1995 without ever getting it. Chung Hong, the 8-year-old who'd watched her father die, grew up haunted by what she'd seen. She became an advocate for the victims. Gave interviews. Testified. Demanded that the British government acknowledge the truth. My father was a good man, she said. He worked hard. He provided for us. He never hurt anyone. And they killed him. For nothing. Just because they could. The survivors all told consistent stories. The men had been separated from the women and children. They'd been lined up. They'd been shot. Some tried to run and were shot in the back. It wasn't combat. It was execution. But for decades, no one listened. Or rather, no one with power listened. The British government maintained its position. The killings were justified. The men were attempting to escape. It was a legitimate military operation. The Malayan government, first under British control, then after independence in 1957, didn't push the issue. They had their own problems. Their own conflicts. The massacre at Batong Kali was an inconvenient truth they'd rather forget. So the survivors were left with their grief. Their trauma. Their anger. And no one to hold accountable. But they didn't give up. They kept telling their stories. Kept demanding justice. Even when it seemed hopeless. Even when no one was listening. Because forgetting would mean letting the men who died at Batong Kali be forgotten. Would mean accepting that their lives didn't matter. That what happened to them was okay. And that was something the survivors could never accept. For decades, the soldiers who'd been at Batong Kali stayed silent. They'd been ordered not to talk about it. and most of them obeyed. But in the late 1960s and early 1970s, something changed. Some of the soldiers who'd been there started having second thoughts. Started feeling guilt. Started wanting to tell the truth. In 1970, a former Scots Guard soldier named William Coots gave an interview to a journalist. He'd been at Batong Cali. He'd been part of the patrol. And he said the official story was a lie. "We were told to execute them," Coots said. "It wasn't combat. They weren't trying to escape. We were ordered to kill them, and we did." Coots described how the men had been separated into two groups. How they'd been told to line up. How the soldiers had opened fire on unarmed men. "I've lived with this for 20 years, Coots said. "The nightmares. The guilt. I can't stay silent anymore. The world needs to know what really happened." His testimony was explosive. Here was a soldier who'd been there, confirming what the survivors had been saying all along. It wasn't combat. It was murder. But the British government's response was swift and brutal. They threatened Coots with prosecution under the Official Secrets Act. Said he was a liar. A troublemaker. Someone trying to get attention. Coots backed down. The pressure was too much. He tried to do the right thing, and it had nearly destroyed him. But he wasn't the only one. In 1993, another soldier came forward. Victor Remedios had also been at Batong Cali. And he told the same story as Coots. "It was murder," Remedios said. "There's no other word for it. We killed unarmed men. We were following orders, but that doesn't make it right." Remedios provided details that matched the survivors' accounts. The men had been lined up. They'd begged for their lives. The soldiers had shot them anyway. "I've carried this for 45 years, Remedios said. "I need to tell the truth before I die. Those men deserve that much." Other soldiers began to speak up too. Not all of them. Some took their secrets to the grave. But enough came forward to paint a clear picture. Batong Cali wasn't a combat operation gone wrong. It was a deliberate massacre of unarmed civilians. Ordered by British officers. Carried out by British soldiers. And then covered up by the British government. The soldiers who spoke out faced consequences. Some were harassed. Some were threatened. The British government used every tool at its disposal to discredit them. But they'd done something important. They'd confirmed what the survivors had been saying for decades. They'd given weight to the truth. And they'd made it much harder for the British government to maintain its lie. Before we go deeper into the legal fight for justice, I want to hear from you. Where are you right now? What time is it there? This happened in Malaya in 1948, but it's a story about colonial violence and cover-ups that echoes around the world. Drop a comment with your location and let me know where you're following this story from. In the 1990s, with soldiers coming forward and survivors still demanding justice, activists and lawyers began to think maybe, just maybe, they could force the British government to act. In 1997, survivors and family members filed a legal claim against the British government. They wanted an official inquiry. They wanted the truth to be officially recognized. And they wanted compensation for what had been done to their families. The British government's response? They fought it. Hard. Their argument was simple: too much time had passed. The events happened in 1948, nearly 50 years ago. Evidence was lost. Witnesses had died. It would be impossible to get at the truth now. It was a cynical argument. Because the reason so much time had passed was that the British government had spent decades covering up what happened. They'd destroyed evidence. They'd silenced witnesses. They'd lied. And now they were using their own cover-up as a reason not to investigate. But the survivors and their lawyers persisted. They argued that the passage of time didn't erase the government's responsibility. That war crimes don't have a statute of limitations. That the victims deserve truth and justice, no matter how long it took. The case went through British courts for years. Appeals. Counter-appeals. Legal arguments so complex they'd make your head spin. In 2008, the British High Court ruled against the survivors. Said the government didn't have to hold an inquiry. That too much time had passed. That it would be too difficult and expensive. It was a crushing blow. After decades of fighting, the survivors had lost. But they appealed. To the Court of Appeal. The case was reheard. And in 2012, something remarkable happened. The Court of Appeal ruled in favor of the survivors. Said the British government did have an obligation to investigate what happened at Batong-Kali. The judges said that allegations of this seriousness, of British soldiers committing murder, couldn't just be ignored because time had passed. That there was an obligation under human rights law to investigate. It was a victory. A huge victory. After 64 years, the survivors were finally going to get their inquiry. Or so they thought. Because the British government appealed. To the Supreme Court. The highest court in the land. And in 2013, the Supreme Court overturned the Court of Appeal's decision. Ruled that the government did not have to investigate. That the events were too long ago. That the human rights obligations that might require an investigation didn't apply to events that happened before those laws existed. It was over. The legal battle was lost. But something had changed. The court cases had generated publicity. The story of Batong-Kali was in the newspapers again. Documentaries were being made. The cover-up was falling apart even if legal justice remained out of reach. The British government might have won in court. But they'd lost in the court of public opinion. Because now everyone knew. The secret was out. And it couldn't be put back in. When people talk about the Batong-Kali massacre today, they often call it Britain's My Lai. The comparison is deliberate. And it tells you everything about why this matters. My Lai was a massacre in Vietnam. On March 16, 1968, American soldiers killed between 347 and 504 unarmed Vietnamese civilians. Mostly women, children, and elderly people. It was a horrific war crime. When news of My Lai broke in 1969, it shocked the world. There were investigations. Court-martials. Some soldiers were convicted, though most served little time. But at least there was accountability. At least the truth came out. Batong-Kali happened 20 years before My Lai. The number of dead was smaller, 24 versus hundreds. But the pattern was the same. Soldiers entering a village. Separating civilians. Executing them. Then claiming it was combat. But here's the difference: the United States, for all its faults, eventually investigated My Lai. Held trials. Acknowledged what happened. Britain never did that for Batong-Kali. No investigation. No trials. No accountability. Just denial and cover-up for over 70 years. Why the difference? Part of it was timing. My Lai happened during the Vietnam War, when media coverage was extensive and public skepticism of military claims was high. Batong-Kali happened in 1948, in a colonial war most people had never heard of. Part of it was politics. By 1969, the United States was a democracy with a free press that wouldn't let My Lai be buried. In 1948, Britain was still a colonial power that controlled the narrative in Malaya. And part of it was national self-image. The United States, despite the horror of My Lai, eventually decided that transparency and accountability, however painful, were important values. Britain decided that protecting its reputation and its soldiers from any country important than truth. All are capable of atrocities. The comparison under the right to my lie highlights something important. Circumstances. War crimes aren't unique. What matters is how countries respond when atrocities come to light. Do they investigate? Do they hold people accountable? Do they acknowledge what happened and try to make amends? Or do they deny, cover up, and hope everyone forgets? For over 70 years, Britain chose the latter. And in doing so, they dishonored not just the victims of Bad Kali, but all the British soldiers who served honorably in Malaya and elsewhere. Because covering up war crimes doesn't protect military honor. It destroys it. The truth always comes out eventually. And when it does, the cover-up often looks worse than the original crime. One of the most frustrating aspects of the Bad Kali case has been the documents. Or rather, the lack of them. In any normal investigation of a killing, let alone a mass killing, there would be extensive documentation. Reports. Photographs. Evidence collected at the scene. Witness statements. Medical examinations. For Bad Kali, much of that documentation either never existed or has conveniently disappeared. The official report from the patrol is brief. Clinical. It describes killing 24 bandits attempting to escape. Nothing more. But what about the investigation that happened in 1949, after the People newspaper published allegations of a massacre? That investigation should have generated extensive documentation. Interviews with soldiers. Statements from survivors. Analysis of the scene. Those documents are classified. Or destroyed. Or lost. Depending on which government official you ask. Over the years, activists and lawyers have filed Freedom of Information requests. Demanded access to documents about Bad Kali. Some documents have been released. Heavily redacted. With key passages blacked out. Names removed. Anything that might be embarrassing or incriminating carefully hidden. In 2011, the British government admitted to destroying documents related to colonial-era abuses. They called it routine housekeeping. Critics called it destroying evidence. Among the documents destroyed, files related to the Malayan emergency. Files that likely contained information about Bad Kali. It's a pattern that's repeated with other British colonial atrocities. The Ola Massacre in Kenya. The Chuka Massacre. Bloody Sunday in Northern Ireland. Documents go missing. Evidence disappears. The government claims ignorance. But some documents have survived. And what they show is damning. Internal memos discussing, eliminating, suspected communists. Instructions to soldiers on handling civilians in contested areas. Discussions of acceptable casualties in counterinsurgency operations. The language is coded. Bureaucratic. But the meaning is clear. British forces in Malaya were under pressure to show results. To rack up body counts. To prove they were winning the war. In that context, Bad Kali makes terrible sense. A patrol under pressure to find and eliminate communist guerrillas. A village they suspected of harboring or supporting the enemy. And a decision, whether ordered from above or made in the field, to make an example. The missing documents mean we may never know exactly who gave what orders. Whether the massacre was planned or spontaneous. Whether it was an isolated incident or part of a broader pattern. But we know enough. We know unarmed men were killed. We know the survivors' accounts are consistent and credible. We know soldiers came forward and confirmed it was murder, not combat. And we know the British government has spent decades hiding the truth. The documents that exist tell a story of cover-up. The documents that don't exist tell a story of destruction of evidence. Either way, it's damning. Bad Kali wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a broader pattern of British colonial violence in Malaya and elsewhere. During the Malayan Emergency, which lasted from 1948 to 1960, the British employed brutal tactics. Mass detentions, forced relocations, torture, executions. They created new villages, basically concentration camps, where they forcibly relocated 500,000 ethnic Chinese civilians. The theory was that this would cut the communist guerrillas off from their support base. The reality was that it destroyed communities and lives. They used collective punishment. If a village was suspected of helping guerrillas, the whole village might be punished. Food supplies cut off. Houses burned. Men detained. They tortured prisoners. Beat them. Used water torture. Electric shocks. Whatever it took to get information. Or confessions. Or just to terrorize. All of this was documented. Not by the British at the time, they were careful to hide it. But by historians who've gone through archives. By journalists who've interviewed survivors. By researchers who've pieced together what really happened. And Batang Kali fits right into this pattern. It was brutal. It was unjustified. And it was covered up. But Malaya wasn't the only place. British colonial forces committed similar atrocities in Kenya during the Mau Mau uprising. In Cyprus. In Aden, now Yemen. In Northern Ireland. The pattern was always the same. Brutal suppression of resistance or rebellion. Tactics that violated human rights and the laws of war. And then cover-ups. Denial. Destruction of evidence. In Kenya, British forces ran detention camps where prisoners were tortured and killed. Estimates suggest over 10,000 Kenyans died. For decades, Britain denied it. Then documents emerged. Survivors sued. And in 2013, the British government finally admitted to torture and paid compensation. But that acknowledgement came only after decades of denial. Only after the evidence became overwhelming. Only after legal pressure forced it. The same pattern we see with Batang Kali. This raises uncomfortable questions about British colonial history. About how much violence was committed in the name of empire. About how many atrocities were covered up. Britain likes to think of itself as one of the good guys. As a country that stood against fascism in World War II. As a nation with strong democratic values and respect for human rights. And there's truth to that self-image. But it's incomplete. Because the same country that fought against tyranny in Europe was committing atrocities in its colonies. The same soldiers who liberated concentration camps in Germany were running detention camps in Kenya a decade later. This contradiction is hard to face. It challenges national myths. It forces uncomfortable reckonings with the past. Which is why Britain has been so resistant to acknowledging what happened at Batang Kali and elsewhere. Because once you start pulling that thread, the whole tapestry of British colonial history starts to unravel. And underneath, you find violence. Exploitation. Racism. Things Britain would rather forget. But the victims and survivors won't let them forget. They keep demanding truth. Keep demanding justice. Keep insisting that what happened to them mattered. And slowly, painfully, the truth is coming out. The Batang Kali massacre raises important questions about international law and war crimes. Questions that are still relevant today. In 1948, when the massacre happened, the modern framework of international human rights law was just being established. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted by the United Nations that same year. The Geneva Conventions, which govern the conduct of war and the treatment of civilians, were updated in 1949, just months after Batang Kali. So the massacre happened at a moment when the international community was trying to establish rules to prevent exactly this kind of atrocity. What happened at Batang Kali clearly violated those emerging executing unarmed civilians is a war crime. It doesn't matter if you're fighting guerrillas. It doesn't matter if you suspect civilians of helping the enemy. You can't just line people up and shoot them. But here's the problem: enforcing international law against powerful countries is hard. Especially when those countries won't cooperate. Britain was, and is, a permanent member of the UN Security Council. A powerful nation with significant international influence. When they denied that Batong Kali was a massacre, when they refused to investigate, what could anyone do? The International Criminal Court didn't exist in 1948. There was no mechanism to investigate or prosecute war crimes committed by British forces. And Malaya wasn't an independent country. It was a British colony. So there was no sovereign government to demand accountability. The victims had no recourse. This is a pattern we see throughout colonial history. Colonial powers committing atrocities. Victims having no ability to seek justice. And the international community largely looking the other way. It's only in recent decades that this has started to change. The establishment of international criminal tribunals for Yugoslavia and Rwanda in the 1990s. The creation of the International Criminal Court in 2002. The development of universal jurisdiction, which allows countries to prosecute war crimes committed anywhere. These mechanisms aren't perfect. Powerful countries still often escape accountability. But they're better than nothing. If Batong Kali happened today, there might be more options for justice. International investigations. Prosecutions in international or foreign courts. More pressure on Britain to acknowledge what happened. But even today, getting powerful countries to acknowledge and prosecute their own war crimes is difficult. Look at how long it took for the United States to acknowledge abuses at Abu Ghraib. How Russia denies war crimes in Ukraine. How China denies atrocities against Uyghurs. The Batong Kali massacre reminds us that international law is only as strong as the will to enforce it. And when the alleged perpetrators are powerful nations, that will is often lacking. But it also shows why these laws matter. Why documentation matters. Why witness testimony matters. Why we need to keep demanding accountability, even decades after the fact. Because without accountability, there's no deterrent. Without consequences for war crimes, they'll keep happening. And the victims, whether they're in Batong Kali in 1948, My Lai in 1968, or Ukraine in 2024, deserve better than a world where power protects you from justice. Most of the survivors of Batong Kali are dead now. The massacre happened over 75 years ago. The children who witnessed it are in their 80s and 90s. Many have passed away without ever getting the justice they sought. Chung Hong, who was 8 years old when she watched her father die, passed away in 2021. She spent her entire adult life fighting for recognition of what happened. Giving interviews. Testifying. Demanding that Britain acknowledge the truth. She died without ever getting an official apology from the British government. Without seeing anyone held accountable. Without closure. But she never gave up. In one of her last interviews, she said, "I'm old now. I won't live much longer. But I need people to know what happened to my father. To all the men who died. They weren't communists. They weren't terrorists. They were just trying to feed their families. And they were murdered." Lo Ah Choi, who watched her husband die, passed away in 1995. She'd fought for decades for justice. For compensation. For anything. "I just want them to admit what they did," she said before she died. "I want them to say, yes, we killed innocent men. We were wrong. I'm sorry. That's all. Just tell the truth." She never got that either. The few survivors still alive are very elderly. Their memories are fading. But their commitment to truth hasn't. They're supported by their children and grandchildren. People who didn't witness the massacre firsthand but have inherited the fight for justice. These descendants have formed advocacy groups. The Action Committee condemning the Batong Kali massacre. They've lobbied the British government. Organized commemorations. Kept the memory alive. Because they understand that if they stop fighting, if they let the story be forgotten, then the men who died really will have died for nothing. In Malaysia, December 12th, the date of the massacre, is remembered. There are annual ceremonies at Batong Kali. Memorials. Moments of silence. The Malaysian government has been more supportive than in the past. In 2011, they officially called for Britain to investigate. Said the survivors deserved truth and justice. But Malaysia has its own complicated history with this. For decades after independence, they didn't push the issue. They had other priorities. They didn't want to damage relations with Britain. It's only in recent years that they've been more willing to confront what happened. To support the survivors' demands for justice. But by then, so many survivors had already died. So much time had been lost. The survivors who remain are frustrated. Angry. But also, in a way, resigned. They've been fighting for most of their lives. They've seen legal cases fail. They've watched British governments come and go, each refusing to properly investigate. They know they probably won't get justice before they die. But they keep fighting anyway. For their parents. For their siblings. For the memory of that terrible day. And for future generations. So that what happened at Batong Kali is never forgotten. So that Britain can never fully bury this truth. The survivors are heroes. They've carried an impossible burden for decades. Trauma. Grief. The frustration of knowing the truth but being unable to get anyone with power to acknowledge it. But they haven't broken. They haven't given up. They've kept telling their story, kept demanding justice, kept refusing to let the dead be forgotten. That takes courage. Extraordinary courage. And it deserves to be recognized. The Batong Kali massacre is part of a larger conversation Britain needs to have about its imperial past. A conversation it's been reluctant to have. British schools teach about the British Empire, but the curriculum tends to focus on the positive aspects. Trade. Infrastructure. The abolition of slavery, while downplaying Britain's role in the slave trade itself. The fight against fascism in World War II. The darker parts of empire, the violence, the exploitation, the racism, get less attention. Students might learn about the Bengal famine or the Amritsar massacre, but as exceptions rather than examples of broader patterns. This selective memory creates a distorted view of history. It allows Britain to see itself as fundamentally good, with a few unfortunate incidents along the way. But Batong Kali, along with similar atrocities in Kenya, Cyprus, Northern Ireland, and elsewhere, tells a different story. It tells us that British imperial violence wasn't exceptional. It was systematic. In recent years, there's been more willingness to confront this history. Historians like Caroline Elkins, who documented British atrocities in Kenya, have forced uncomfortable truths into public consciousness. Activists and descendants of victims have pushed for acknowledgement and reparations. Legal cases, while often unsuccessful, have kept these issues in the news. Some progress has been made. Britain apologized and paid compensation for torture in Kenya. There have been official inquiries into Bloody Sunday in Northern Ireland. But there's still resistance. Resistance to teaching the full truth about empire in schools. Resistance to official apologies for colonial atrocities. Resistance to opening all the archives and letting historians see what's there. Some of this resistance is about national pride. Britain wants to see itself as a force for good in the world. Acknowledging widespread colonial violence challenges that self-image. Some of it is about legal liability. If Britain officially acknowledges atrocities, survivors might sue for compensation. The government worries about opening the floodgates to claims. And some of it is political. There's a strand of British politics that sees criticism of empire as unpatriotic. That wants to celebrate British history rather than critically examine it. But this resistance to truth is ultimately counterproductive. Because the truth comes out anyway. And when it does, the cover-up makes things worse. Germany confronted the Holocaust. It was painful. It took decades. But Germany today is respected for how it's dealt with that dark history. The United States has made some progress in confronting slavery and segregation, though much work remains. South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, while imperfect, provided a model for dealing with historical atrocities. Britain could learn from these examples. It could decide that truth and accountability are more important than protecting national pride. It could fully open the archives. All of them. Let historians see everything. Let the truth come out, however uncomfortable. It could establish a truth commission to examine colonial-era violence. Not to prosecute individuals who are long dead, but to create an official record. To acknowledge what happened. It could apologize. Officially. Not vague regrets, but clear acknowledgments of specific atrocities. Like Bat-on Cali. And it could provide reparations. Not just money, though that matters too. But memorials. Education. Support for descendants of victims. This isn't about hating Britain or diminishing its achievements. It's about having an honest, complete understanding of history. The good and the bad. Because if you only remember the good, you're likely to repeat the bad. And if you cover up atrocities, you dishonor not just the victims but everyone who believes in truth and justice. Britain can be better than its past. But only if it's willing to honestly confront what that past actually was. One last time before we close this story, I want to hear from you. Where in the world are you? What time is it there? This massacre happened in Malaya in 1948, but its lessons about colonial violence, cover-ups, and the fight for justice are universal. Please share your location and thoughts in the comments. And if this story moved you, share it. Because the only way these victims are remembered is if we refuse to let their stories die. 76 years after the Bat-on Cali massacre, the fight for justice continues. Most of the people directly involved, perpetrators and victims alike, are dead. But their descendants carry on. In Britain, there are activists and historians who refuse to let this story be buried. They continue to demand that the government release all documents. That there be a full, official investigation. That the truth be acknowledged. In Malaysia, the descendants of the victims continue to organize annual commemorations. They teach young people about what happened. They make sure the memory stays alive. And they haven't given up on justice. Even though legal avenues have been exhausted. Even though the British government has shown no willingness to properly investigate. Because giving up would mean accepting that what happened was okay. That the lives of those 24 men didn't matter. That powerful countries can commit atrocities and never face consequences. And that's not acceptable. The Bat-on Cali massacre teaches us important lessons. That war crimes happen. Even, especially, when committed by countries that see themselves as civilized and democratic. That cover-ups can last decades. But truth has a way of emerging anyway. That survivors deserve to be believed. Their testimony is valuable. Essential. Even when it challenges official narratives. That accountability matters. Without consequences for atrocities, they'll keep happening. That time doesn't erase responsibility. 76 years is a long time, but it doesn't make murder okay. And that memory is a form of resistance. As long as people remember Badon Kali, as long as they demand justice, the British government can never fully bury what happened. In 2023, on the 75th anniversary of the massacre, there was a memorial service at Badon Kali. Descendants of the victims were there. Malaysian officials, British activists, historians, journalists. They stood where the village had been, where 24 men had been lined up and shot. And they remembered. They read the names of the dead. They laid flowers. They demanded, once again, that Britain acknowledge the truth. And they promised, we will never forget. We will never stop fighting. Our fathers and grandfathers will not be forgotten. This is what justice looks like when official justice is denied. It looks like memory. Like commemoration. Like refusing to let the story die. It's not enough. The survivors and their descendants deserve better. They deserve official acknowledgement. An apology. Compensation. All the things they've been denied for 7 decades. But until that day comes, if it ever comes, this is what they have. Memory. Truth-telling. Resistance. And it matters. Because every time the story is told, every time someone learns about Badon Kali, every time the British government is forced to defend its refusal to investigate, the cover-up weakens a little bit more. The truth spreads a little bit further. Justice becomes a little bit more possible. The men who died at Badon Kali were rubber tappers. Poor workers. They had no power. No influence. No ability to protect themselves from the soldiers who killed them. But their memories have power. Their stories have influence. And the people who've carried those stories, who've refused to let them die, they've achieved something remarkable. They've ensured that this atrocity, which Britain tried so hard to bury, is now part of the historical record. That it can't be denied or forgotten. They've forced conversations about British colonial violence that Britain would rather not have. And they've shown that even when official justice is denied, there are other forms of justice. Memory. Truth. Refusal to forget. Badon Kali happened on December 12, 1948. 24 unarmed men were executed by British soldiers. For 76 years, Britain has refused to properly investigate or acknowledge what happened. But the survivors, their descendants, and their allies have never stopped fighting. Never stopped demanding truth. Never stopped honoring the memory of those who died. And they never will. Because some things should never be forgotten. Some truths should never be buried. And some fights for justice should never end. This is Badon Kali. Britain's My Lai. A massacre the British government tried to hide. And failed. Because the truth always comes out. Eventually. If people are brave enough to keep telling it. Never forgotten. Never forgiven. Never again. The city glittered with winter magic. Snow dusted the cobblestone streets. Christmas markets filled the air with the scent of roasted chestnuts and mulled wine. The grand Habsburg architecture stood elegant against the grey winter sky. It was supposed to be a night of celebration. For Hermine Bronsteiner, a 27-year-old secretary, it had been an ordinary Monday. She'd finished her shift at the textile factory where she worked in the administrative offices. Her colleagues described her as diligent, punctual, always impeccably dressed despite modest means. Hermine was engaged to be married. Her fiancé, Franz, worked as a clerk at a bank. They were saving money for their wedding, planned for the following spring. Everything about Hermine's life was ordinary, predictable, safe. That evening, she left the factory at her usual time, around 6:30 p.m. She waved goodbye to her supervisor, pulled her wool coat tight against the December cold, and headed toward the tramway stop on Favoriten Street. The number 71 tram would take her home to her small apartment in the 10th district. It was a route she took every single day. 15 stops. 23 minutes. A journey so familiar she could do it with her eyes closed. Several witnesses later recalled seeing her at the tram stop. She stood under the lamppost, stamping her feet to keep warm, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. She seemed perfectly normal. Not anxious. Not afraid. Just another working woman heading home after a long day. The tram arrived at 6:47 p.m. Hermine boarded through the rear entrance, as was customary for those without monthly passes. She paid her fare to the conductor, a middle-aged man named Otto Muller, who would later testify that she seemed in good spirits. The tram was moderately crowded. Workers heading home. Shoppers returning from the markets. The usual evening commuters. Hermine found a seat near the back, by the window. She placed her small handbag on her lap and stared out at the passing streets, lit by gas lamps and shop windows. The tram rattled through Vienna's winter evening. Stop after stop. Passengers got on and off. Hermine remained in her seat, her face reflected in the dark window glass. But something was wrong. Several passengers would later report noticing a man. He'd boarded at the third stop, on Riumenplatz. Tall, wearing a dark overcoat and a fedora pulled low over his face. He didn't sit down. Instead, he stood near the rear of the tram, one hand gripping the overhead rail, the other buried in his coat pocket. His eyes, multiple witnesses agreed, never left Hermine. The tram continued its route through the darkening streets. At the 8th stop, Sutterollerplatz, something happened that would change everything. The tram doors opened. A few passengers got off. The conductor rang the bell, signaling departure. And then someone screamed. It was a woman near the front of the tram. She was screaming and pointing toward the back. The conductor pulled the emergency brake. The tram screeched to a halt. Other passengers began shouting. Chaos erupted. Because there, slumped against the window in the back seat, was Hermine Braunsteiner. A knife protruded from her chest. Blood soaked the front of her wool coat, spreading in a dark stain across the fabric. Her eyes were open, staring at nothing. And the man in the dark overcoat and fedora was gone. He had vanished into the Vienna night, leaving behind a young woman's body and a mystery that would grip the city for months to come. The police were called immediately. Within minutes, officers swarmed the tramway. They cordoned off the scene. They took statements from the traumatized passengers. But the killer had disappeared like smoke. No one had seen him leave. No one could give a clear description of his face. The fedora had obscured his features too well. All they knew was that somewhere in Vienna, a murderer walked free. And this was only the beginning of one of the most perplexing criminal cases in Austrian history. Detective Inspector Karl Richter arrived at the scene within 30 minutes of the murder. At 43 years old, Richter was one of Vienna's most experienced homicide detectives. He'd served in the Imperial Army during the Great War, surviving the brutality of the Eastern Front. After the war, he'd joined the Vienna Police Department, bringing with him a methodical mind and an unflinching ability to confront violence. But even Richter was shaken by what he found on the number 71 tram. The body of Hermine Braunsteiner remained exactly as the passengers had found her. The medical examiner hadn't yet arrived. She sat upright in her seat, the knife still embedded in her chest, her handbag still clutched in her lap. Her face, Richter would later write in his report, bore an expression of complete surprise. As if she'd been struck so suddenly that she hadn't even had time to register fear. The knife itself was unremarkable. A common kitchen knife with a wooden handle, the kind you could buy at any market stall in Vienna. No distinguishing marks. No manufacturer's stamp. Utterly generic. The weapon of convenience, not premeditation, Richter initially thought. But he was wrong. The medical examiner, Dr. Heinrich Gross, arrived shortly after 8 p.m. He was a precise man, clinical in his assessments, never given to speculation. After a preliminary examination, he turned to Richter with a grim expression. "This was not a crime of passion," Dr. Gross said. "Look at the angle of entry. The depth." Meanwhile, other officers were interviewing the passengers who'd been on the tram. Their testimonies painted a disturbing picture. The man in the dark overcoat had boarded at Riumenplatz. He'd stood near Hermine for at least 5 stops. Several passengers noticed him staring at her, but no one thought much of it at the time. Vienna trams were crowded. People stared into space. It seemed normal. No one saw the actual stabbing. This was the most puzzling aspect of the crime. The tram had been moderately crowded. Hermine had been sitting by the window, but there were people nearby. How had someone stabbed her without anyone seeing it happen? One passenger, an elderly woman named Frau Schmidt, provided a crucial detail. "There was a moment," she said, her hands shaking as she spoke to the police. "Just before the tram reached Sutteroller Platz. The lights flickered. You know how they do sometimes on the old trams? They went out for maybe 3-4 seconds. Everyone complained. And when they came back on, people started getting ready for their stop. No one was paying attention to anything else. 3 to 4 seconds. That's all it had taken. In that brief moment of darkness, the killer had struck. One precise thrust. And then he'd melted back into the crowd of passengers, just another commuter preparing to exit at the next stop. By the time the body was discovered, he'd already slipped off the tram and disappeared into the Vienna streets. It was a crime of stunning audacity and cold precision. Richter ordered his men to canvass the area around Sutteroller Platz. They questioned shopkeepers, taxi drivers, anyone who might have seen a man in a dark overcoat fleeing the scene. Nothing. The killer had vanished completely. The next step was to investigate the victim. Who was Hermine Braunsteiner? Why would anyone want her dead? Richter and his partner, Detective Otto Neumann, visited Hermine's apartment late that night. It was a modest one-room flat in a working-class neighborhood. Neat. Clean. Sparsely furnished. They found letters from her fiancé, Franz Kovacs. Love letters, full of plans for their future together. They found her diary, where she wrote about her daily routine, her hopes for marriage, her dreams of saving enough money to buy a small house someday. There was nothing suspicious. No evidence of debts. No indication of dangerous associations. No secret lovers. No gambling problems. Hermine Braunsteiner appeared to be exactly what she seemed, an ordinary working woman living an ordinary life. Which made her murder all the more baffling. The next day, Richter interviewed Franz Kovacs. The young man was devastated, barely able to speak through his grief. He had an airtight alibi. He'd been at work at the bank until 7 p.m., with dozens of witnesses to confirm it. Hermine's colleagues at the textile factory were equally shocked. She had no enemies, they insisted. She was well-liked, quiet, kept to herself mostly. Never caused trouble. Never argued with anyone. Dead end after dead end. By the end of the second day, Richter had a murder weapon that could have come from anywhere, a victim with no apparent motive for being killed, and a killer who had committed the crime in front of dozens of witnesses without anyone seeing his face or understanding how he'd done it. The Vienna newspapers were having a field day. "Phantom killer strikes on tramway," screamed the headlines. "Mysterious death of innocent secretary." Vienna police baffled by brazen murder. The public was terrified. If a woman could be murdered on a crowded tram in the middle of Vienna, then no one was safe. Richter felt the pressure mounting. The police commissioner wanted results. The newspapers wanted answers. The public wanted justice. But Richter had nothing. Not yet. On the third day, something changed. A letter arrived at police headquarters. It was addressed to Detective Inspector Karl Richter. No return address. Posted from somewhere in Vienna's first district. Richter opened it with a letter opener, his hands steady despite the sense of foreboding creeping up his spine. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The handwriting was neat, almost elegant. And the message chilled him to his core. Dear Inspector Richter. You are looking for the man who killed Hermine Braunsteiner. You will not find him because you are asking the wrong questions. Hermine was not innocent. She was not what she appeared to be. She deserved what happened to her. And she is not the last. There are others who deserve the same fate. You cannot stop what is coming. Sincerely. A friend of justice. Richter stared at the letter for a long moment. Then he called for his entire team. Because this was no longer just a murder investigation. This was the beginning of something far more sinister. Where are you watching from, and what time is it there? Drop your location in the comments. And if you're finding this case as gripping as I am, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. This investigation is about to take a very dark turn. The letter from the self-proclaimed friend of justice changed everything. Detective Inspector Richter immediately ordered handwriting analysis. The letter was sent to the police laboratory, where experts would examine the paper, the ink, the penmanship, looking for any clue to the writer's identity. Meanwhile, Richter couldn't shake the implications of the message. Hermine was not innocent. She deserved what happened to her. She is not the last. These weren't the ravings of a madman. The writing was too controlled, too deliberate. This was someone who believed, with absolute conviction, that Hermine's murder was justified. But what could a 27-year-old secretary possibly have done to deserve being stabbed to death on a tramway? Richter intensified his investigation into Hermine's background. He interviewed everyone who'd known her, friends, family, neighbors, former classmates. He went through her personal effects with forensic precision, looking for anything that might reveal a hidden life. Still nothing. The handwriting expert's report came back inconclusive. The writing was educated, suggesting someone with at least a secondary education. The author was likely right-handed, probably middle-aged based on the formation of certain letters. But beyond these basic observations, there was little to go on. The paper was common stationery available at hundreds of shops across Vienna. The ink was standard fountain pen ink. No fingerprints on the letter, the writer had been careful. Days passed. The city remained on edge. Women were afraid to ride the tramways alone. Newspapers ran daily updates, even when there was nothing new to report. Then, on December 18, 12 days after Hermine's murder, it happened again. The victim this time was Margarethe Schön, a 32-year-old music teacher. She lived in the 6th district and gave piano lessons to children of wealthy families. She was found in her apartment by one of her students' mothers who had come to drop off payment for the month's lessons. The door was unlocked. Margarethe lay on the floor of her sitting room, a knife protruding from her chest. The same type of knife. The same precise placement. The same instant death. But this time, the killer had left something behind. Pinned to Margarethe's dress was a note. Written in the same elegant handwriting as the letter to Richter. Margarethe Schön was a deceiver. She pretended to be virtuous while corrupting the innocent. Justice has been served. There are still others. The reckoning continues. Richter was called to the scene immediately. As he examined Margarethe's body and read the note, a horrifying realization settled over him like a shroud. This wasn't a random killer. This was someone on a mission. Someone who believed they were righting wrongs, punishing people for perceived sins. A vigilante. The question was, What had Hermine and Margarethi done to earn a place on this killer's list? Richter's investigation into Margarethi's life revealed surprising information. While she presented herself as a respectable music teacher, she had a secret. For the past 3 years, she'd been having an affair with one of her students' fathers, a wealthy merchant named Leopold Krauss who was married with 4 children. The affair was discreet, but not entirely secret. Several people knew about it, including Krauss's wife, who had chosen to look the other way rather than face the scandal of divorce. Was this the corruption of the innocent the killer referred to? And what about Hermine? Richter went back through all his notes on Hermine Braunsteiner, looking for anything he might have missed. He found it in an interview with one of her former colleagues, a comment that had seemed insignificant at the time. Oh, Hermine was very proper now, but there were rumors about her before she got engaged. Something about a married man at her previous job. But that was years ago, and she'd changed. She was a good girl. Richter tracked down the details. 3 years earlier, before working at the textile factory, Hermine had been employed at a law firm. There, she'd had an affair with one of the senior partners, a married man with 2 children. When the partner's wife discovered the affair, there was a scandal. Hermine was quietly dismissed. The partner kept his job. Hermine had been 24 at the time. Young, perhaps naive, certainly making a mistake. But she'd moved on. Found a new job. Met Franz. Became engaged. Built a respectable life. Until someone decided her past sins required punishment. The pattern was becoming clear. Both victims were women who had been involved with married men. Both had, in the killer's twisted logic, corrupted the innocent or deceived others about their virtue. Both had been judged, convicted, and executed by someone who saw themselves as an arbiter of morality. Richter felt sick. He was dealing with a moral crusader. Someone who believed they were doing God's work, cleansing Vienna of women they deemed immoral. And according to the killer's own words, there were more names on the list. The question was, how many more? And how could Richter stop murders when he had no idea who the next victim might be, or when the killer would strike? Vienna's police commissioner called an emergency meeting. The press was going wild. The public was panicking. 2 women had been murdered in 12 days, and the killer was taunting the police with notes. "We need to warn the public," the commissioner said. "Women need to be on their guard." Warn them about what? Richter replied, frustration evident in his voice. That they might be murdered if they've had an affair? That someone has appointed themselves judge and executioner over private moral failings? "We need to do something, Inspector. I need more time. More resources. Permission to expand the investigation." The commissioner granted it all. Richter assembled a team of 20 detectives. They began a massive undertaking, creating a list of women in Vienna who might fit the killer's criteria. Women who were known to have affairs, or reputations that might make them targets. It was an impossible task. Vienna was a city of nearly 2 million people. The list could potentially include thousands of women. Meanwhile, the killer remained silent. No more letters. No more murders. For 2 weeks, nothing happened. The city began to breathe easier. Perhaps it was over. Perhaps the killer had been scared off by the increased police presence. Richter didn't believe it for a moment. Someone who had killed twice with such cold precision wasn't going to stop. They were simply waiting. Choosing their next victim. Savoring the fear they'd created. And then, on January 8, 1927, the 3rd victim was discovered. Anna Fischer was 29 years old, a seamstress who worked from her home in the 9th district. She specialized in alterations and custom dressmaking for middle-class clients. Her body was found by her landlady, who had come to collect the monthly rent. The door to Anna's workshop was ajar. Inside, Anna lay across her cutting table, a knife in her chest, her blood staining the fabric she'd been working on. Pinned to her collar was another note. Anna Fisher lived a double life. By day, a modest seamstress. By night, a companion to men who betrayed their vows. She profited from sin. She has been judged. The purification of Vienna continues. Detective Inspector Richter stood in Anna's workshop, fighting the rage building inside him. 3 women. 3 precise murders. 3 notes condemning victims for their moral failings. He ordered his team to investigate Anna's background immediately. Within hours, they discovered her secret. Anna had indeed been living a double life. While her seamstress business was legitimate, she also earned money as an escort. Nothing illegal, she wasn't a prostitute in the formal sense. But she accompanied wealthy married men to operas, dinners, social events. And sometimes, those evenings ended in private apartments. She was discreet. Professional. She never caused scandals or demanded more than her agreed-upon fees. But in the killer's eyes, she was guilty. Guilty of profiting from sin. Guilty of enabling married men to betray their wives. Guilty enough to die. Richter gathered his team for an emergency briefing. "We have a pattern now," he said, pinning photographs of all 3 victims to the board in the conference room. 3 women. All killed with the same type of knife. All stabbed once, precisely, through the heart. All involved in some way with extramarital affairs. But why these specific women? Detective Newman asked. There are hundreds, maybe thousands of women in Vienna who could fit this profile. Why these 3? It was the right question. And Richter didn't have an answer. He studied the photographs of the victims. Hermine Bronsteiner. Secretary. 27 years old. Killed on a tramway. Margarete Schön. Music teacher. 32 years old. Killed in her apartment. Anna Fisher. Seamstress. 29 years old. Killed in her workshop. Different ages. Different professions. Different neighborhoods. What connected them? There has to be a link, Richter said. Some connection we're not seeing. Someone who knew all 3 women. Someone who knew their secrets. His team began the painstaking work of cross-referencing the victims' lives. Did they shop at the same stores? Attend the same churches? Have mutual acquaintances? Visit the same doctors? Days of investigation yielded no clear connection. Meanwhile, the killer's notes were analyzed by Vienna's leading criminal psychologist, Dr. Ernst Becker. Dr. Becker was a pioneer in the emerging field of criminal profiling. He'd studied under Sigmund Freud and had consulted on several high-profile cases across Europe. His analysis was both illuminating and disturbing. Your killer, Dr. Becker told Richter, is highly intelligent and well-educated. The language in the notes is formal, almost literary. The handwriting suggests discipline and control. We already knew that. But consider the psychology, Dr. Becker continued. This person sees themselves as a crusader, yes, but more than that, as a corrector of moral imbalance. Notice the phrasing, justice has been served, the purification of Vienna continues. These aren't the words of someone consumed by rage. This is calculated. Methodical. Why women? Richter asked. If he's so concerned with extramarital affairs, why not target the married men involved? Dr. Becker smiled grimly. An excellent question. And the answer tells us a great deal about our killer. He, or she, we shouldn't assume gender, blames women for tempting men. In the killer's worldview, men are weak, easily led astray. Women are the true sinners, the corrupting influences. So we're looking for someone with a deep-seated misogyny. More specifically, someone who has been personally wounded by a woman's infidelity or perceived immorality. This feels personal, Inspector. This isn't an abstract crusade. Someone has suffered, and now they're exacting revenge on women they see as similar to whoever hurt them. This opened new investigative avenues. Richter's team began looking for men whose wives had left them for other men. Men who had been publicly humiliated by infidelity. Men who might harbor such intense resentment that it had twisted into this murderous campaign. They found dozens of possibilities. Angry husbands. Jilted fiancés. Men whose families had been destroyed by affairs. But none of them connected to all three victims. And meanwhile, time was running out. If the pattern held, another woman would die soon. Richter made a controversial decision. He held a press conference and released specific details about the case that had been kept from the public. He described the killer's pattern. The type of victims. The notes. The methodology. If you are a woman who has been involved in an extramarital relationship, Richter told the assembled reporters, you may be in danger. Please contact the police. We can offer protection. It was a desperate gamble. The press conference caused a sensation. Within days, hundreds of women came forward, some anonymously, admitting to affairs and begging for protection. The police couldn't possibly protect them all. But Richter hoped that the publicity might have another effect. It might force the killer to pause, to reconsider, to make a mistake. He was wrong. 5 days after the press conference, on January 15th, the fourth victim was found. This time, the killer had escalated. Claudia Berger was 26 years old, a librarian at the Vienna University Library. Unlike the previous victims, Claudia wasn't found immediately after her death. Her body was discovered in the basement storage room of the library, 3 days after she'd been reported missing by her sister. The delay was significant. The killer had had time. Time to stage the scene. Time to send a message. When Richter arrived at the library and descended to the basement, he found something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Claudia's body had been arranged with grotesque care. She sat in a chair, her hands folded in her lap, the knife still in her chest. Around her, on the floor, the killer had used her blood to write a message. For sins cleansed. Vienna must be purified. The guilty will all pay. Justice never sleeps. The letters were large, deliberate, written with what appeared to be a paintbrush dipped in the victim's blood. Several police officers who witnessed the scene had to leave to vomit. Even Richter, hardened by years of investigating violence, felt his stomach turn. This was different from the previous murders. This wasn't just efficient execution. This was ritual. Theater. A performance designed to shock and terrify. The killer was growing bolder. More confident. More theatrical. Richter examined the scene with Dr. Gross, the medical examiner. Time of death? Richter asked. Based on decomposition and the temperature down here, I'd estimate approximately 72 hours ago. That would be January 12th, sometime in the evening. The same day Richter had held his press conference. The killer had murdered Claudia as a direct response to the police going public. It was a statement, you cannot stop me. The investigation into Claudia's background revealed the now familiar pattern. She had been having an affair with a married professor at the university. They'd been discreet, meeting in his office after hours, at quiet cafes on the outskirts of town. The affair had ended 2 months earlier when the professor's wife had become suspicious. But apparently, ending the affair hadn't saved Claudia. In the killer's eyes, she'd already committed her sin. The sentence had already been passed. Richter returned to headquarters and stared at his board. 4 victims now. 4 women murdered for their involvement with married men. The gaps between murders were decreasing. Hermine to Margarethi, 12 days. Margarethi to Anna, 21 days. Anna to Claudia, 7 days. The killer was accelerating. And the theatrical staging of Claudia's body suggested something even more troubling. The killer was enjoying this. What had started as a cold, efficient campaign of moral punishment was evolving into something more sadistic. The notes were analyzed again. The blood writing introduced a new element. The handwriting was the same, confirmation that all 4 murders were connected to the same killer. But the tone had changed. Earlier notes were almost apologetic in their formality. Justice has been served. Now the language was becoming grandiose. The guilty will all pay. Justice never sleeps. The killer was losing whatever restraint they'd once had. Dr. Becker, the criminal psychologist, revised his profile. The killer is devolving, he told Richter. The murders started as cold, calculated executions. Now we're seeing ritualistic elements, theatrical staging, grandiose messaging. This suggests the killer is losing touch with reality, becoming consumed by their mission. Is that good or bad for us? Richter asked. Both. Good because when killers become more theatrical, they tend to make mistakes, leave more evidence, take more risks. Bad because it means the murders may become more frequent and more violent. That night, another letter arrived at police headquarters. Same elegant handwriting. Same formal tone. But the content was more disturbing than ever. Dear Inspector Richter, I read about your press conference with great interest. You think you can stop me by warning my targets? You cannot. They deserve what is coming to them. I know you are looking for me. You will never find me. I move through Vienna like a ghost. I see everything. I know everyone's secrets. There are so many guilty women in this city. So many who pretend to be virtuous while living in sin. So many who destroy families and corrupt the innocent. I am not a murderer, Inspector. I am an executioner. I serve a higher justice than your laws. Claudia Berger was number 4. But there are more. Many more. You asked women to come forward and seek protection. How naive. Do you really think you can protect them all? Do you really think you can stop what must be done? Vienna is a cesspool of moral corruption. I am the cleansing fire. Watch carefully, Inspector. The next one will be soon. Very soon. Your adversary. The Purifier. The letter was signed with a new name. No longer a friend of justice. Now, the Purifier. The killer had given himself a title. An identity. A purpose. Richter knew this was bad. Very bad. Serial killers who named themselves, who created personas, who viewed their crimes as a mission, those were the most dangerous kind. They didn't stop. They escalated until they were caught or killed. Richter called an emergency meeting with the police commissioner and the mayor of Vienna. We need to increase patrols on all tramways, Richter said. We need officers in plain clothes riding the routes. We need to monitor known locations where women meet with married men, hotels, cafes, private clubs. You're talking about enormous resources, the commissioner replied. I'm talking about saving lives. The resources were allocated. For the next week, Vienna's police force operated at maximum capacity. Undercover officers rode tramways. Stakeouts were established at hotels. Women who had come forward were given escorts. The newspapers ran daily updates, keeping the public in a constant state of fear. And the killer remained silent. No new murders. No new letters. 7 days passed. Then 10. Then 14. Hope began to grow that maybe, just maybe, the increased police presence had scared the killer into hiding. Richter didn't share that hope. He'd been studying serial killers from other countries. Cases from London, Paris, Berlin. He knew that silence didn't mean safety. It meant planning. And on January 30th, his worst fears were confirmed. Not with one murder, but with two. The morning of January 30th, 1927, would become known as Black Sunday in Vienna. Two women were found dead within hours of each other. The first was Elisabeth Kramer, 31, a government clerk who worked in the Ministry of Finance. She was found in her apartment in the 3rd District by her cleaning lady. The familiar scene. A knife through the heart, a note pinned to her dress. The second was Rosa Mandel, 28, a shopkeeper who ran a small haberdashery in the 5th District. She was found in the back room of her shop by a customer who had noticed the store open but unattended. Same method. Same knife. Same note. Two murders, committed within a 3-hour window. The killer had struck twice in one morning. Detective Inspector Richter stood in Rosa Mandel's shop, reading the note left on her body. Two more sins erased. Two more deceivers removed from Vienna. The purification accelerates. You cannot stop what has begun. 6 down. More to follow. The city will be cleansed. 6. 6 women dead. And the killer wasn't just continuing, they were accelerating. Richter's team moved with frantic efficiency. They processed both crime scenes simultaneously, interviewing neighbors, analyzing evidence, looking for any connection between the two victims. As expected, both women fit the pattern. Elisabeth Kramer had been involved in a 3-year affair with her married supervisor at the ministry. The relationship had been an open secret among her colleagues, though officially denied. Rosa Mandel had been the mistress of a wealthy textile merchant for 5 years. He'd been promising to leave his wife and marry her, but never had. Rosa had finally ended the relationship 6 months ago. 6 months. The affair had been over for half a year, but the killer still saw fit to punish her. This suggested something crucial. The killer wasn't targeting active affairs necessarily, but anyone with a history of such relationships. Which meant the potential victim pool was enormous. Every woman in Vienna who had ever had an affair with a married man, whether recently or years ago, could be on the killer's list. Thousands of potential targets. And Richter had no way to protect them all. The double murder sent Vienna into absolute panic. Women refused to leave their homes. Husbands hired private guards for their wives and daughters. The tramways, once crowded, now ran nearly empty as people avoided public transportation. Businesses suffered. The opera house saw attendance drop by half. Restaurants closed early. The killer had achieved what perhaps they'd wanted all along. They'd brought the entire city to its knees with fear. That evening, Richter sat in his office, surrounded by files, photographs, notes, evidence from 6 murders. He felt the weight of failure crushing him. 6 women dead. 6 families destroyed. And he was no closer to catching the killer than he'd been after the first murder. His partner, Detective Newman, entered with coffee and a grim expression. "The press is calling for your resignation," Newman said quietly. "I know. The commissioner is under pressure from the mayor. The mayor is under pressure from Vienna's elite. They want results. I want results too, Otto. But I can't catch a ghost." Newman sat down across from Richter. "What if we're approaching this wrong?" he said. "We've been trying to find a connection between the victims. What if the connection isn't between them, but between the killer and them?" "What do you mean?" "Think about it. The killer knows intimate details about these women's private lives. Details that aren't public knowledge. The notes mention specific aspects of their affairs. Who they were with, how long the relationships lasted, details that only someone close to the situation would know. Richter sat up straighter. You think the killer knows the victims personally? Not all of them, necessarily. But the killer has access to information. Private information. The kind of information that gets shared in confessionals, or with doctors, or with the police, Richter said slowly. The thought had occurred to him before, but he'd pushed it away. Now it came roaring back. What if the killer was a police officer? Or someone with access to police files? It would explain how the killer could move through Vienna without being caught. How they could know victims' addresses, schedules, secrets. It would explain the meticulous planning, the ability to strike and vanish. Richter felt sick at the thought. But he couldn't ignore it. We need to audit everyone who has had access to these case files, he told Newman. Every officer, every clerk, every administrator. Quietly. We can't let anyone know we suspect someone internal. Carl, if word gets out that we're investigating our own department. I know. But we have to consider every possibility. The internal audit began the next day, conducted with absolute secrecy. Meanwhile, the city held its breath, waiting for the next murder. Days passed. 1 week. 2 weeks. No new victims were discovered. But on February 15th, something else arrived at police headquarters. A package. Addressed to Detective Inspector Carl Richter. Inside was a book. A ledger, actually. Bound in black leather, its pages filled with neat, elegant handwriting. The same handwriting from all the notes. Richter opened it with trembling hands. Inside were names. Dozens of names. Women's names. Each with detailed notes beside them, addresses, occupations, descriptions of their sins. It was a hit list. The killer's target list. And 6 of the names had been crossed out. The 6 women who were already dead. But there were 43 names left. 43 women marked for death. And at the front of the ledger, a handwritten note. Dear Inspector Richter. You have worked so hard. You have tried so diligently to stop me. But you cannot. I am giving you this list as a courtesy. A professional acknowledgement of your efforts. These are the guilty. These are the women who have corrupted Vienna with their sins. I will kill them all. You can try to protect them. You can try to warn them. You can try to catch me. But you will fail. I am patient. I am methodical. I am inevitable. The purification will continue until Vienna is clean. With respect for a worthy adversary. The purifier. Richter stared at the list of names. 43 women. 43 lives in danger. And somewhere in Vienna, a killer who believed themselves unstoppable. The ledger changed everything. Detective Inspector Richter now had a list of the killer's intended victims. 43 names. 43 women who were marked for death. It was both a gift and a curse. A gift because now the police could potentially save lives by warning and protecting these women. A curse because with 43 targets, the killer could strike anywhere, at any time, and the police couldn't possibly protect everyone simultaneously. Richter made the decision immediately. Every woman on the list would be contacted, warned, and offered police protection. The logistics were nightmarish. Vienna's police force simply didn't have enough personnel to provide round-the-clock protection for 43 people. Richter requisitioned support from the federal police and even the military. Within 48 hours, officers were dispatched to locate and warn each woman on the list. Some of the women were easy to find. Others had moved. 2 had died of natural causes since the list was compiled. 1 had left Austria entirely. Of the 40 remaining women, 38 agreed to police protection. 2 refused, claiming they didn't believe they were really in danger. Richter tried to convince them, but legally, he couldn't force protection on unwilling citizens. Those two women haunted him. Meanwhile, the forensic analysis of the ledger itself yielded frustrating results. The paper was common stationery. The ink was standard fountain pen ink. No fingerprints, the killer had worn gloves. The handwriting analysis confirmed what they already knew: the person who wrote the ledger was the same person who wrote all the notes left at crime scenes. But it gave them no closer to an identity. Dr. Becker, the criminal psychologist, was brought in to analyze the ledger. "This is remarkable," he said, paging through the book. "Look at the level of detail. The killer has been compiling this list for years. Some of these entries are dated back to 1923. For years," Richter said. "The killer has been planning this for 4 years? At least. And look at the information. Details about where these women work, who they associate with, where they live. This required extensive surveillance. This person has been stalking these women for years. But why wait until now to start killing?" "Something triggered it," Dr. Becker said. "Some event in the killer's life that pushed them from planning to action. A personal tragedy, perhaps. A loss. Something that made the resentment finally boil over into violence. This opened a new investigative avenue." Richter's team began looking for significant events in late 1926, deaths, divorces, financial ruin, public scandals, that might have triggered someone with pre-existing resentment toward unfaithful women. They found hundreds of possibilities. Vienna in 1926 was still recovering from the economic devastation of the Great War. Families were broken. Fortunes were lost. Social structures were crumbling. Any number of people could have experienced a triggering event.